Hi everybody, welcome to ParanormalZoneTV, and thank you so much for joining us tonight. What I'd like to know, whoever is watching the show tonight, if you would please subscribe, I'd really appreciate it, and please don't forget to give the show a like. Now tonight I have an awesome guest, and I'm so excited. This is a topic I have never covered before, and our guest tonight is Joshua Cutchin. And let me tell you a little bit about him. He is the author of 12 books which can be purchased on Amazon. And our topic tonight is Joshua's book, Thieves in the Night, Paranormal Child Abductions. Joshua is the author of speculated, nonfiction, and professional tuba player. Joshua has appeared on a wide variety of paranormal programs, discussing his work, including Coast to Coast AM and History Channel's Ancient Aliens, and a reoccurring roundtable guest on Where Did the Road Go podcast. He has been invited to speak at many paranormal events, and his writings have been featured in numerous books. His website is joshuacutchin.com. So with that, let's bring Joshua on. Hi, Joshua. Thank you so much for being on the show. I'm so excited to have you.
Well, it's an absolute pleasure to be here tonight. And I have to say that I really love the way that you pared down my biography, because it gets too long sometimes, and you made all the right choices. So that's perfect. Thank you for that wonderful introduction.
Thank you. I know it would have been a book if I had wrote down your biography. Okay, so before, I found this statement that you had made, and I want to ask you before, because we do a lot of shows on missing people and mysteries and unsolved crimes and this and that. And I saw this, what you wrote. You said, you found curious similarities in fairy abductions to some of the details of David Pilates has reported in mysterious disappearance cases, such as berry picking, stormy weather, and vanished person wearing bright colors. Would you talk about that, please?
I would love to. And it's interesting because the whole missing 411 phenomenon, I think, is sort of a paranormal Rorschach test, if that makes any sense. And what I mean by that is it seems to conform to whatever your favorite paranormal topic is. So I realize in full irony, I realize the irony when I say that I think that it has a lot to do with fairy stuff, because I love the fairy stuff, so of course I see that more than anything else. But there's some outliers in the missing 411 stuff that I think is best described or best explained historically through the folkloric lens that we once viewed fairies. Just as sort of a disclaimer up front, fairies are not traditionally viewed as these little tiny lovely pixies with wings that grant wishes and that sort of thing. That's definitely a children's book affectation from the Victorian era. If you look back through folklore, especially of Western Ireland, but honestly the worldwide body of folklore, you'll see that fairies were oftentimes they could be harmful, and they didn't always conform to this idea of tiny, nor did they have wings. The wings, in fact, were sort of an artistic flourish. So that's sort of a palate cleanser for everyone who hears fairies and thinks that fairies are these lovely little things, because they can certainly be problematic. And one of the things that they were really well known for was abducting people. And it was interesting to me looking through a lot of the older fairy folklore, again, focusing on Western Europe, but you can find parallels throughout different parts of the world, about how not only would they abduct people, but they were associated with boulder fields, which is another data point that David Pilates has pointed out. Certain colors that you would wear would offend the fairies, very region dependent, but red was in a lot of places considered a no-no, and I know that Pilates has taken a look at that aspect as well in terms of people who have gone disappearing with bright colored clothing. So depending on where they disappeared, they might have offended the fairies of that particular area. I do find really interesting the fact that fairies were long associated with supernatural storms. And that's something that we hear time and time again in these missing 411 narratives, is that the search is oftentimes called short because inclement weather of all types rolls in. And in a lot of these older stories, the weather and the winds were the means by which fairies would move across the landscape, and how they would levitate themselves and people similarities, and I guess the missing 411 Rorschach test for me looks like Faerie.
Well, unfortunately, the only fairies I could use tonight for pictures are ones with wings. I couldn't find.
That's fine.
I couldn't find a fairy without wings.
Yeah, it's hard. It's seeped into pop culture so much. There are a couple of people, if you look a little bit older, who did some really great artwork. Arthur Rackham is one of them. John Bauer is one of them, and Brian Froud, who had a long-standing partnership with the Jim Henson Company, and designed all the goblins for Labyrinth, and did all the designs for Dark Crystal as well. They tend to they show the sort of winged fairies often enough, but they also sort of skew a little bit towards that darker stuff as well. So for future reference, those are always good. But I'm not going to get upset about it.
Oh, thank you, because I have to be careful because I can get hit with the copyright.
Oh, yeah.
I've been hit with the copyright for using a picture, so I have to be careful.
That is no fun whatsoever. And also, just from another standpoint, there are, even though fairies were traditionally not viewed in this way, there are plenty of modern day fairy sightings that do incorporate things like the wings. I for myself, in the way that I tend to view these topics, I tend to think that suggests that this phenomena, or these phenomena, if you look at all the supernatural, are somehow responding to cultural expectations in the way that they appear to us. I think that probably plays a big role in these things. There are certain things that we expect to see, so we see them. What's really interesting to me is that one of my colleagues, Dr. Simon Young, who has compiled this wonderful resource, it's a fairy census of different sightings. He's released a new edition. His initial edition was through 2014, and this new one is 2014 to present. And there is sort of a trend that fairy impressions, or descriptions of fairies, seem to be moving back towards those older ways of understanding them, those older, darker ways, and those ways where they might appear as a full-sized human being without wings, but some other sort of strange characteristics, which is much more in line with folklore. So it's really interesting to see how cultural expectations seem to ebb and flow with this as well.
So why did you write this book?
That's a great question. I had the good fortune of going to Ireland in 2017, and I remember distinctly being in a pub and mentioning that I was really interested in fairies, and even in Ireland, where people tend to talk about this stuff more often, the fairy stuff, even they thought that was kind of odd that here's this 6'3" American big guy interested in fairy folklore. But for some reason, it's always stuck with me. And I had a lot of I don't know if anxiety is really the right word, but a lot of hesitation writing Thieves in the Night, because the subject matter does get really dark, as I'm sure you're aware having read it. It goes in some uncomfortable places, not only in terms of what these other presences might do to us, but also the way that we've treated each other because we have feared these different presences as well. For example, I'm sure we can talk about it at some point if you want to, but the whole changeling phenomenon in Ireland was often used as an excuse for infanticide, and some of the statistics are pretty shocking when you actually take a look at them. So I guess what drew me to it was this long-standing suspicion that I've had that was fueled by the work of the ufologist Jacques Vallée, who in 1969 in his book Passport to Magonia pointed out that there were a lot of similarities between the UFO phenomenon and the fairy folklore. And that has been the gift that keeps on giving, because I keep on taking a little thing here and there and really just trying to pull as much as I can out of it. And I wanted to see if there was something that was analogous to the UFO alien hybrid program in the older fairy folklore. So that was a big driving motivator of that. Another thing is that there really, at the time, it's changed since then. This book is about 7 years old now, which is hard to believe, 6 or 7 years old. Is that at the time there wasn't really a good reference book for the changeling phenomenon. There was an out-of-print book that was only in German called Der Wechselbalg, but that was pretty much much it. So I sort of wanted to fill that gap as well. So that was another motivation for it.
Okay, so I'll ask you about the changelings when I have finished these other questions on fairies.
Sure.
Okay, changelings. Remind me. Well, you can. I'm sure.
Well,
it'll come up. I know.
If we're focusing on this.
I know. All right. So then, okay. So why did they abduct children?
That's a great question. You'll find lots of different references here and there. There are some indications that it might have just been spite. Generally speaking, if you're focusing on Western Europe, generally speaking, there was a sense that a lot of these fairy populations were a dying race. You can find references as old as Chaucer, who wrote Canterbury Tales, talking about the fairies like sort of leaving their world and the exodus of the fairies. You can see that reflected too in, the Lord of the Rings with the elves traveling into the West, right? So this is an old standing motif, and there was this idea that the fairies were just sort of a race on the decline, and to sort of bolster their ranks, they needed an infusion of basically fresh genetic material. They needed to repopulate their kind, and one of their ways that they would do that would be by abducting human children. Interestingly enough, if you look at some UFO experiencers' accounts of why aliens are so interested in our genetic material, they'll sometimes give the same answer, that the Greys are dying and that they need human genetics to repopulate themselves. So that's definitely a resonance there. So that was one reason. Another reason was that fairy food was always a sham. It was always just trash that was cloaked with magic to look like something else, and that extended to fairy milk that fairy children would need to have. So sometimes it was just not so much about abducting the child as it was about swapping out and putting the fairy child in a position to receive human milk, because human milk was what would help the babies grow. And then a third reason that you see cited often is that it was almost sort of a hospice arrangement for elderly fairies, where the human child would be taken and one of the elderly fairies would be placed in the cradle to live out its remaining days in comfort. So those are pretty much the three reasons that you'll see referred to most often.
Are any of them ever returned?
Often. So it gets kind of murky, because there's a lot of stuff that's clearly folklore, and trying to find actual stories of changelings that have happened is a little bit more difficult. But most of the changeling stories do end in a positive resolution. And maybe now would be a good point to talk about changelings, because I told you.
Oh yeah, sure. Go ahead.
So the idea of the changeling is a fairy substitute for a human child. So not only is the child abducted, because that's sort of a separate issue too, children were abducted as well, but a lot of times in these stories, a child would be abducted from the cradle and replaced with a changeling, which would be one of those two types that I described, like either a fairy infant or an elderly fairy. And oftentimes it was, children who were unbaptized between birth and baptism, that liminal period in between there, when they would be most vulnerable. And, sometimes the changeling was the fairy baby, sometimes it was an elderly fairy, sometimes it was a stock or a fetch. In other words, it was an inanimate object, like a doll or a wooden log that was enchanted by fairy magic to look like an animate, human baby. And then over time, in all these narratives, returning to our original question, in all these narratives, a parent, typically the mother, would detect that something was off about their child. It would typically in these stories, the child would eat and eat and eat, but never put on any weight. It would be very disagreeable and cry incessantly. Some of the more fanciful stories have, a parent coming home and hearing the pipes being played in the house and peeping through the keyhole and seeing their child, which is actually, one of these fairy changelings, playing the bagpipes or something, dancing with the fairies. Those are the more extreme versions. But to get your child returned, there were a ton of different folk remedies for this. One of the tamer ones, it's an odd one, but it's a tame one, would involve doing something completely nonsensical to sort of trick the fairy into to revealing how old it was. Especially useful if it's an elderly fairy that's been replaced as a changeling, right? And so you would do something like, brew beer in eggshells, and the idea was that the changeling would say, "Oh, I'm really old, but I've seen the acorn before the oak." I knew, saying, "I'm super old," but never beer and eggshell brew or something like that, and then that would be confirmation. So after you've confirmed that your child is a changeling, then you would set about contacting a magical practitioner, cunning man, cunning woman, fairy doctor, that sort of thing, or even a witch, or a sorcerer who would give you advice. And that advice was also very varied. Sometimes, honestly, some of the more mundane ones are just abandoning the changeling. And you can see how this gets problematic really quickly when people think that they have a changeling and they don't, right? Sometimes, honestly, a lot of the remedies for getting your child returned, if you have a changeling, would be to abuse the changeling, quite frankly. And anything and everything that you can imagine would be of a physical pain nature would be inflicted upon the fairy. And the idea was that the fairies would see you mistreating one of their own so badly that they would rush in and re-exchange your child to get one of their own back so that they could protect them. Now, as we've alluded to here, this was obviously ripe for exploitation. And there's a book that I always feel like I have to mention this in these interviews because I really don't want this statistic to go unappreciated. There's a book by a scholar named Elaine Farrell that took a look at infanticide just in Ireland. And again, fairy belief and changeling belief is very widespread. Just in Ireland, just between 1850 and 1900, we're dealing with an island that's about the size of Indiana, if anybody doesn't have a context for it. And she looked at instances where children only less than 3 years old were murdered. And she found 4,645 cases in a 50-year period.
Oh my God.
And not all of them, obviously, but a lot of them were because they were suspected of being changelings. What you see in a lot of these stories is that alongside people who earnestly believed that their child was a changeling, you would find people using that excuse for ending the lives of children who had developmental disabilities. And it's a very sobering aspect because there's a lot of crossover in terms of modern fairy scholarship trying to pinpoint if there was a particular disability that people mistook for changelings. And there are some candidates that fit that bill really well. Most of them satisfy a couple of criteria, but not the whole thing. But yeah, so this belief system was abused. Now, having said that, it is interesting that people point to our modern diagnosis of disabilities and they say things like, well, obviously people were mistaking, for example, autistic children for fairies, and that's interesting, and that could be a possibility. But in a lot of these stories, as I alluded to, one of the ways that you found out that you had a changeling was you sort of tricked it into speaking full sentences. So the idea that you're tricking an infant, which is a lot of these cases were infants, you're tricking an infant into speaking a full sentence, and that was because of some sort of mundane medical condition, just doesn't make sense. So there does seem to be something else legitimately strange going on there. The way that I tend to think of of changelings nowadays is I tend to compare them more to, and having been involved in this, you'll know exactly what I'm referring to by this. I tend to think of them more like possessions or walk-ins than I do an actual physical substitute. And there are some indications of this because you had asked how many children have been returned from being taken by the fairies. That particular exchange of the fairies returning the child to the original parents isn't often observed in these stories. They'll abandon the child and then they'll open the door and the child will be on the doorstep, or they will turn their backs and they'll turn right back around again and the child will be the actual child instead of the changeling. So the change happens instantaneous, and oftentimes you don't actually see the physical exchange of a changeling for a human child. So that puts me in the mindset that something more, spiritual or metaphysical was going on here rather than that physical exchange. There's even an allusion in Walter Evans Wentz's Fairy Faith in the Celtic Countries to a child who was returned and was observed. And in that instance, the child did not physically leave or depart. There were no little people coming in and returning this child. It was an older child, and they actually sort of acted as if they'd been in a deep sleep, and they, remarked to their mother that they just had the craziest dream or something to that effect. So I tend to think that the fairy abduction was probably a little bit more, again, spiritual than it was actually physical. But like so many of these things, exactly where you draw the line between the psychic and the physical is something of a vague line. It doesn't get defined very well.
Well, with this changeling, did it have the exact same? Was it the exact same replica, or did they have some changes? Did they have a different color to them?
Good question. Excellent question. In some of the stories, the child starts out looking identical, and slowly over time, with those behavioral issues that I mentioned, it dawns on the parents. Other times, it's recognizable from the very beginning, and there are changes. Again, not hard and fast rules, but things that you'll find scattered across the different accounts are things like oversized eyes. Lots of references to rail-thin arms and legs. So you will find some sort of references to that as well. So in some cases it was apparent from the start that there was something, something was different about the child, let's say that, right away. Yeah, so there, and of course, that sort of description of these large eyes and thin limbs certainly puts me in the mindset of these stories where UFO experiencers have met their hybrid children, and they tend to describe them in very similar terms. They sort of have these oversized eyes and these thinner limbs, and oftentimes in the UFO stuff they'll have wispier hair. But yeah, there does seem to be something to that, I think.
Okay, in the event that the changeling remains with the family, do they live out a normal life?
Well, tragically, a lot of these stories end with the changeling dying, regardless. In which case, the belief, and again, just mostly focusing on Ireland and the British Isles, the child was buried, but it was never believed that your actual child had died. Your actual child was alive and well in Fairyland. You had buried a sham. You had buried an empty shell. That was the changeling. There are a couple of cases, not many, like you can count them on one or two hands, of changelings that grew up and were integrated into society. Most of these were kind of, I don't know if there's a politically correct way to say it, but they were sort of regarded as the village idiot. They were sort of lived a life of begging and roving about the countryside. There is one example from France that Walter Evans Wentz talked about, who became known as the Little Corrigan, and Corrigan is one of the region-specific terms for the fairies in this particular area. Even at 10 years old, even at 30 years old, rather, he was no taller than a 10-year-old, and he sort of had some peculiar proportions. But he apparently was very, he lived a very long life, and he was able to function. Although he certainly seemed to have some homicidal tendencies. I think he tried to kill his mother on a couple of occasions.
Oh,
but I don't think any photographs were ever taken, but Evans Wentz, who wrote Fairy Faith in the Celtic Countries in 1911, made a reference to this individual still being alive, so that would have put him around 70 years old. So that's probably the example of the changeling that survived the longest. For the most part, it was not a good prognosis, which again further reinforces some of these people who think that there were medical disabilities that were responsible for the changeling legends.
All right, so we're still in chapter 3.
Yeah,
have to go to 18. Okay, now you talk about gender bias.
Yes. Well, so you'll find this in a lot of different cultures, where things from the spirit world tend to prey upon the members of society who are regarded as the most vulnerable. And in a lot of these agrarian societies, these pre-industrial societies, that was typically perceived as women and children. And that's certainly consistent with the fairy stuff. I don't really know if the problem with comparing something like that to the modern UFO lore is that the number of like really good broad studies that have been done trying to like pin down who is most susceptible to alien abductions and things like that. I just don't know if a survey sample has really been big enough and has been scrutinized enough from a statistical standpoint to really give us any insight into that. I mean, there's the free study that Ray Hernandez put together, which had about 4,600 people, but I'm sort of talking in circles here. There are some who would suggest that same trend holds true in the modern alien abduction, where women and children are the most vulnerable. And certainly, if you sort of read the UFO literature, there does seem to be this tendency for abductions to start in childhood. And if you make it after a certain point in your life, generally speaking, and of course there are plenty of exceptions I'm well aware of, but generally speaking, you're more or less safe from having a lifetime of abductions unless something else happens. Again, plenty of exceptions to that rule, but a lot of people who have subsequent experiences later in life will then sort of remember things that had happened to them earlier in childhood. So whatever this thing is, it certainly seems to take an interest in us at an early age.
All right, so when are babies most vulnerable? Is it the certain birthdays, days of the week, month, season?
Yeah, so there were certain things that certain best practices that you could have that would lead you to be less likely, not unlikely, but less likely to be kidnapped by the fairies. One of the things that I mentioned a little bit earlier in passing was baptism in a lot of these cultures. There was this idea that between the birth and the actual christening, the child was especially vulnerable to being abducted by the fairies. And of course, it makes a certain degree of sense because they're born into the world, but they're not sort of accepted into the dominant Christian culture of the time, so they're kind of in this in-between space, and that's very consistent with what a lot of people have observed about the paranormal, sort of thriving in this in-between space. So there was that. There was an inclination or an indication, you don't see it referenced too often, that fairies were most active on Wednesdays. Again, I find this interesting because that's the same day of the week that John Keel, Fortean author, said that he perceived, he from his data saw that people were seeing UFOs the most often was on Wednesdays as well. So Wednesdays, again, middle day of the week, middle in between, that same theme holds. And there was also, as we mentioned sort of earlier about sort of weather, it was more likely to be taken on days that were sort of misty because they were sort of fairy days. There was sort of an indication there too. So there were certain things you can do, certain best practices, and that extends to preventing fairy abduction. One of the easiest and most common things was to put an item of iron or steel in the crib. And, from there you end up reading some of these horrific stories about, people dangling iron scissors above a crib. Yeah, it's like, or like putting a dagger in the crib or something. But, truth be told, it just didn't really even need to be a weapon. Weapons were probably a little bit better, a little bit more helpful from a magical standpoint. But there's even a story. Maybe I can look it up real quick. There's a story from the Boyne Valley in Ireland where, and again, historical account, folklore, fireside tale, I don't know. It all tends to blend together with some of this fairy stuff. But there was a tale from that particular region in Ireland where the fairy queen supposedly ordered 3 of her underlings to take a child. It was the third child of this couple. And when the fairies got there, they were just, they tried to take this child, but they couldn't because there was this gigantic iron beam that was laid across this baby's chest. And they tried to move the iron beam to take the baby, and they couldn't. And as it turned out, it wasn't an iron beam at all. It was a needle that was just pinning the child's clothes together. So, yeah, the ability for iron to repel things. And of course, you and I were speaking a little bit before we got on the air about Rosemary Ellen Guiley. Rosemary looked into this a bit. Does iron repel the supernatural, or does it attract the supernatural? You can find conflicting answers either way, but in the fairy lore, it is fairly clear that iron and its derivative steel, just the existence of it was enough to sort of repel these things or to prevent them from taking children. Exactly why that is, who knows? I read something a while back that suggested that, metalworking was emblematic of humankind's development and how we sort of mastered nature. The fact that, we used to use stone blades and things like that, but now we're actually using iron. And with iron, with metal, forged metal, you can sort of bend the environment to your will. You can cut trees faster, and you can, you can build railroads, right? So it might have something to do with that. Also, it's worth noting, in some of these cultures, the blacksmith of a community was considered basically a magical practitioner in their own right, and sort of had the same sort of powers that if you looked further east, you would ascribe to a shaman, in northern Eurasia. And in fact, there are lots of indications in that part of the world that a lot of shamans were blacksmiths and vice versa. So there's something about metal forging that the supernatural does not seem to be too keen on historically.
Okay. What about fairies using childlike voices in the woods? It's a common fairy lore.
Yeah, it's super creepy. The idea that they would actually call out to you, but yeah, there are. Well, so this gets kind of into one of the topics that I think about a lot, and that is how often have these things that we notice remain the same over centuries, and we just sort of put a new name to it, right? Because it's become really common in the modern Bigfoot research to believe or to suspect that Bigfoot is able of mimicking human cries as well, and mimicking human voices and calling people's names as well. And it's like, well, if you didn't see Bigfoot, that could easily fit into this older fairy folklore. But yeah, there were indications that these fairies would oftentimes sound like crying infants in the woods. Another thing that John Keel noted, as I mentioned Keel earlier, sound like crying infants in the woods to draw people in. The really disturbing thing about that is that they've done studies on this, and the human brain is actually hardwired to respond to an infant crying. Like, even if you don't have kids and you don't like kids, there's something in your brain evolutionarily that makes you want to go find the crying child. Even if it's just to tell it to hush, that's something as well. So, and then you do find these stories, which I've read them not only in Europe, but I've read them as European imports into the New World, where they sort of blend with indigenous belief of, these, for lack of a better term, fairies. And I'm thinking specifically about Latin American duendes, which are sort of a fairy import from the Iberian Peninsula. Calling out children's names, and sometimes sounding like, or even appearing like their parents or their uncles or their aunts or something. So, yeah, it's really a disturbing possibility.
How far back do they have documentation on these? Oh no! Okay, hold on.
I'm very sorry.
It's okay.
We're having a lot of heavy wind here, and my power blinked out for a moment.
Okay. That's fine. We're okay. Just put your video on.
Oh, yeah. Sorry about that.
That's okay.
As I said, yeah, it's been kind of, and maybe I'm irritating the fairies by talking about them too much.
Oh no!
And I sort of blinked out here. You probably saw it.
Yes, I did.
So fingers crossed that doesn't happen again. Your question was asking about how far back something has happened?
No. What? What's wrong?
Oh, for me? No, your question was asking...
Yeah. How far back is the documentation on these fairies?
Well, that's a great question, and it's also tied into like what fairies are, and that's there are fairy scholars, and they have gone back and forth as to exactly what the fairies began as, and it's hard to tell because it gets mixed up with Christianity and some other stuff. There are a lot of indications that fairies were once closely associated with the human dead, and that was how they were understood, either as you die and you become a fairy, or the fairies escort the dead or something. It's something I wrote a lot about in my last fiction book, Ecology of Souls. There are also indications that if you ascribe to what Christianity said the fairies were, that they were angels or demons, sometimes it's said to be the angels who were too bad for heaven and too good for hell, and that when there was the war in heaven and the gates of both heaven and hell shut, the angels fell to the ground, wherever they were, and they became the spirit of that place. There's another possibility that they were sort of minor gods and goddesses of the land, certain regions, certain woods, certain clearings, certain brooks, or streams, or whatever, had a spirit associated with them, and over time that sort of evolved and became the fairies. So it really is anyone's guess. It kind of gets a little bit muddier, the waters do, with the rise of theosophy, which, again, I'm sure, having been involved in this as long as you have, you're familiar with Madame Blavatsky and her influence in the late 19th century. And that's when you start seeing references to fairies being elementals and sort of getting mixed up in that, which is probably, again, an outgrowth of them being sort of spirits of place. So exactly how far back these stories go depends on what you think they were, So if you have somebody who is talking about, if you have a Roman legionnaire talking about going into the forests in England and talking to people who believe in the spirit of that place, then maybe that was a fairy. Who knows? But I think the easiest way to say that is just ancient. And there are scholars who have done a better job than I have in terms of tracing the root of the word fairy and how far back it goes. But it just seems to be, to me at least, like one of those words that we use for this thing that we don't really know what it is. And we have to find a word, and the word that we use is the word that our culture tends to use, which is part of the reason that I think that the modern UFO experience is related to the fairy stuff. People sometimes get me a little bit backwards. They think that I'm saying that, like, today's aliens are fairies, or that, the fairies that people were seeing way back when were aliens, and I don't think either of those is accurate. I think that we just don't have the tools to describe whatever this other intelligence is that's visiting us and interacting with us. So yeah, it's very old, and it has analogs everywhere, and that's something else that gets overlooked a lot. A lot of what I have focused on has been in Western Europe, but a majority of North American tribes had beings that were little people, or that would fit some of the other criteria for what fairies were. You'll find the same thing in South America. You'll find the same thing in Africa. You'll find some references in Australia and in Asia as well. It seems to really be something that we have interacted with everywhere. And of course the question is, why did all these communities come up with so many similarities? Things like missing time, like being taken by the fairies for a day and coming back 10 years later. Like, why do you see that in Europe and in where I am, in Georgia? The Cherokee belief and the Yunwi-Chunsi and the Nunyonahi, some of their fairies. You read it and it's like it could easily have been from Ireland or Scotland or England or Scandinavia or something like that, because there are all these little details like missing time and like an association with earthworks and things like that. It really is impressive. So I think that it suggests that we're interacting with something that personality to it.
Okay, so you feel a connection to fairies. I can feel that. So, do you talk to fairies? Have they ever visited you? Have you ever seen one?
So I know better than to do that, right? Like,
I don't know.
I know just enough to get myself in trouble if I try, right? I mean, I've had some odd experiences, and I'm not sure if it's them or someone else. I mean, if fairies take offense at the F word, as they were said to, that's why you have all these euphemisms for them: the good people, the good neighbors, the people of peace. Like, I'm not saying that they were good or they were peaceful. It's just trying to keep them happy so they don't hear you saying the word fairy. I use that word a lot, and I don't want to say I haven't received any blowback, but like I know other folks who do interact with the fairies, and they use that word as well, and they have not suffered any adverse effects. I do have friends who have had who claim some really remarkable experiences, fairy witches and the like, who have a regular interaction with these things. I've had some stuff that, depending on what you want to make of it, would be fairy adjacent, I guess. And that also speaks to the way that, like, the fairy folklore really blends with the ghost stuff, and obviously, as I've said, the UFO stuff. It blends with the Bigfoot stuff too. The fairy folklore touches on a lot of stuff. So, depending on how you want to interpret it, there was a time when my parents were adding on to their home, and during that period of time, again, that in-between time that we've been talking about, right? My mom and I both would find stacks of 4 quarters in, like, the oddest places. Like, the one that I remember the most was, we used to have one of those big, thick dictionaries, right? Like a 6-inch wide dictionary. You know, I'm talking, like, we don't have those anymore, right? Nobody uses those anymore. But those things did exist, kids. And so like, how often, even back then, did you really pull a dictionary off the shelf, right? Like once every couple of weeks, maybe, probably months. And I remember my mom and I were, like, looking up a definition of a word, or how to spell a word, or something like that. And we pulled out this huge dictionary, and behind the dictionary was a stack of 4 quarters. And it would show, the same thing would show up on top of the fridge, or behind, a mug that you hadn't used since Christmas, or something like that. And, depending on how you want to view that, like, I prefer to think that sounds like fairy stuff, but you could easily say that's poltergeist stuff, and that's very consistent with, the fact that some poltergeists were blamed specifically on fairies. Like, poltergeist effects were fairy effects to certain people in certain regions. So there's that. There was also a period in my life when I had a lot of synchronicities popping off, and there's a tree in the backyard that, when I got here, moved into this new house, it's a tree, it's got a fork, and I just sort of called it my fairy tree, whatever. And I had been gifted a silver coin by someone who claimed that they had fairy ancestry, and I treasured it, but I wanted to do something special with it as opposed to just sitting it on a shelf. So when I got into this new house, I put the coin in there, and I poured out a little bit of milk, and I said thank you and whatnot. And there's a tree next to that tree where I put the coin, that I have a little gnome attached to, like a little gnome that's built for being on a tree, right? You put in a nail and you hook the gnome on he's like sort of looking at, sort of attached to the tree and looking at you. And then I got home one day, and nobody that I know of had been in our backyard. It might have already been fenced in at that point, because we added a fence later, but nobody had been in the backyard. My wife had been home with our boys, and that gnome was no longer on the tree. It was sitting at the fork in the fairy tree right above where I put the silver coin. And if the number one, it's on a nail that it has sort of a lip and a hook. So I don't think that the wind could have taken it off, but even if the wind had taken it off, it wouldn't have moved it upright, 5 or 6 feet to the adjacent tree. So that kind of gave me a little bit of a moment where I was like, well, maybe somebody was in the backyard and they knocked it, and I can't really find an explanation for that either, unless it was my wife and she forgot about it or something like that. So those are the 2 sort of fairy adjacent things that I've had happen, besides just odd feelings when I visited certain places in Ireland, which, you know, if you visit some of these places, you will definitely come away with the sense that you are not alone when you are alone at some of these ancient monuments that are associated with the fairies.
Do you leave any food for the fairies?
Yeah, well, not as a regular habit. I did. So I was like a kid in a candy store when we went to Ireland, because I think one of the conservative estimates, again, landmass roughly the size of Indiana for you Americans like myself who have no idea about how big other countries are. A conservative estimate at one point that I read was that there were 60,000 ring forts in Ireland at one point. And unfortunately, a lot of those have been lost to construction and roadways and all sorts of different projects. But even with that, you can drive by tons of these places, and they aren't, you know, necessarily marked as historical locations, even though they are. You know, they're Iron Age settlements, right? I, you know, made it a point to stop at every one that I could find. I put together a little bit of a YouTube video that you can find online of me visiting some of these spots. But there was one that was, for example, we went to a different historical site, and they just happened to have a fairy fort on the property, because that's the way it is in Ireland with a lot of these older, you know, the big houses, as they used to call them. And I remember I made it a point that day at the bed and breakfast to just put away some bread and some some sweets to leave at the top of the fairy fort, because I still very much tread carefully in those areas. And it's interesting, you know, I had the chance to speak to some people over there and have some conversations, and I'll never forget being in a pub in, I think this was in Dublin, it might have been in Galway, and you know, very, you know, cosmopolitan town, and speaking to like this 20-something and talking about fairies, and like there was this thing that was said, which is, you know, well, of course I don't believe in fairies, but I'm scared to death of them, you know. So you'll find these people who like live alongside this folklore, and I've heard about it so long that they still respect it enough. And there are a lot of people who really wouldn't admit to believing in these things, but would also not be caught dead in one of these spaces at night, which is, you know, typically the time of day that belongs to the good folk. So yeah.
All right, so let's go on to chapter 10. It's Paranormal Child Abduction, and you talk about witches. That Europe is known for witch traditions, both historical and legendary. So you want to talk about that?
Yeah, well, it's really interesting, and again, this speaks to something that we had mentioned earlier about how fairy folklore really does seem to blend over into so many different areas. The truth of the matter is, you know, we've talked about changelings specifically as a fairy thing, but in the years since I've written about, since I've written Thieves in the Night, I have stumbled across other allusions to changeling stories from lake monsters in indigenous North American tribal lore. I've run across stories of wild men and wild women leaving behind changelings as well, and of course, you know, as you mentioned, witches. The whole idea is that, you know, depending on who you spoke to, and I think that this is part of it's true and part of it's not, that witches sometimes kidnap children to, quite frankly, make into potions. The distribution and how often this happened has probably been overblown over time, I would think, from reading the literature, but at the same time it appears to have happened, unfortunately enough. Very dark subject, one of the reasons I approached this book with apprehension. But there were specifically this desire to take children for a variety of different reasons. And this seems to have happened relatively recently. I mean, you know, in the late summer of 1950, there was a 7-year-old boy by the name of Adolfo who didn't return after gathering firewood in Chile. And they searched the entire island for this child, and then one day he just shows up again on a small mound of dirt next to a neighbor's house. And, you know, the boy just seems like, you know, catatonic, more or less. And eventually they tease out of him that these strange men had appeared in the forest and taken him away. This sounds like a UFO story, right? But in terms of like where that was and the way it was interpreted, there was the parents parents actually thought that there were these sorcerers that had taken him to a cave. So these ideas are still remain with us in a very big way. And one of the reasons that you see child abduction in association with witches is, I think, an emphasis on Lilith, who was, depending on what you read and what sources you use, was Adam's first wife before Eve, and for one reason or another, some more salacious than we'll talk about, for some reason or another, Lilith was expelled, and expelled from the Garden of Eden. And in some stories, she and Adam already had a whole slew of children at this point. Sometimes in some stories, those were the origins of the fairies. So we were talking about how old the fairies. If you believe that, then they're literally biblical.
Well, I always thought Lilith was a demon.
Well, that's so. At the time, once she was expelled, she sort of obtained that status as demon. And it gets kind of confusing because Lilith seems to be at least partially a reinvention of this Mesopotamian wind demon named Lamashtu, who would come through with talons and abduct children. So there's that children connection again, in addition to her possibly having children with Adam. And one of the stories, the reason why she was expelled from the garden was that she and Adam had actually conceived children, but they hid them from God, and that was seen as a transgression. This is some of the older apocryphal Judaic texts. So Lilith sort of ends up attaining that demon status after the fact, and that sort of speaks to something else that I've found interesting, is that a lot of these things, these beings, which I do think have an objective reality to them, their nature changes over time, and what we think of them as changes over time. I mean, a lot of these we tend to think of, especially if we're coming out of that sort of Abrahamic religion mold, that sort of Christian mold. A lot of the times that we talk about demons, we think of something like as old as time itself. They once were demons, they are demons, and they forever will be demons. But if you look at some of these local traditions of lay people in different areas, there's also a tendency for demons to evolve into that over time. A good example of this is in parts of Europe they would execute people, criminals and whatnot, at the crossroads, and sometimes they would just bury them at the crossroads, which is part of the reason, amongst a whole bushel of others, why crossroads sort of had a magical power, in addition to being, again, an in-between space like we've talked about. But they were originally remembered as being, the spirit of a criminal buried at the crossroads. But over time, that memory would fade, and they'd turn into perhaps a demon of the crossroads, and then sometimes that demon would transform into like a fairy of the crossroads. So what's interesting to me, again, talking about the sort of exchange that we have with cultural expectations and all this stuff, and to how we perceive these things, there seems to be something about this phenomenon that sort of reacts to what we expect from it and sort of change in form as well. So Lilith seems to fit into that, and because of Lilith's connection to all these things, she became connected with the witches as well. It was said that Lilith could take the form, I believe this is correct, if it's not, forgive me, it was said that Lilith could take the form of a black cat in some of the older Jewish writings, which obviously has implications for witches as well, and also kind of puts into new perspective that old wives' tale about black cats sucking the breath out of children.
Oh,
babies,
yeah.
Right? Yeah.
Yeah. There was a story you had in this chapter about Mary Scully, the 16-year-old. It's around 2200.
I'm trying to remember. Mary Scully. Oh, yeah. I do remember this. And this sort of approaching these topics, it's like, where do you draw the line? Like, is a disappearance the same thing as a supernatural abduction? But yeah, she was a bedridden girl who was taken in 1943, and supposedly, even though she was bedridden, it was said that she had been spotted walking out of the house, and alongside her was a woman who was wearing a veil and dressed entirely in black. This was in Birmingham. And it's interesting to me, like how again we think of witches as being so sort of it's a superstition. You're not supposed to be afraid of witches, and witches are, there's a lot of witch positivity these days, which is great. I have a lot of witch friends. That's great, but there is a whole body of folklore about these basically evil witches that did things like this that were always very much in line with what you would expect from fairies. Yeah.
Okay, now you also talk about Malaysia remains a hotbed of paranormal child abductions. That's on 2340. And that's
Malaysia is really interesting because there was an anthropologist by the name of, I think it's Ernesto de Martino. I always get his name mixed up, but I think that's his name. And he was really interested in magical practice, and he came to the conclusion that culture, it's not that certain areas of the world are superstitious, it's that cultures that believe in magic have more magical things happen to them, which is an idea that I really love. One of my favorite sort of critters that doesn't get talked about much in cryptozoology or in a lot of these topics is this disembodied head that trails entrails behind it.
I've never heard of that.
Yeah, and it's you'll find it in islands Southeast Asia. There's a variant in Indonesia. There's a variant in Malaysia. They're called the Pontianak and the Penanggalan, I believe. And I'm probably butchering both those pronunciations. And I can't remember which is for which, but there are stories that this is actually the spirit of a woman who died in childbirth, and she goes around flying or sort of swinging through the forests looking for pregnant women. And when she finds them, she attacks them and removes the child from the womb. It's pretty grisly stuff. I'm not familiar with a ton of contemporary sightings of this entity. Every now and then you'll get a YouTube video, but it's usually it's either too vague to tell the difference, or it comes out that it's a hoax. But it's something interesting. It's an interesting variation on this older idea. But there's somebody who's a scholar that I really admire that doesn't get talked too much about in these spaces. Ahmad Jamaluddin, and he detailed a sort of rash of child abduction cases in this part of the world. In June of 1982, there was a 12-year-old by the name of Maswati. She failed to return after she was washing her clothes in the Pahang River. She was found 2 days later, and she was in good health, but she did say that there was a strange girl that she had met while washing her clothes who had invited her to walk with her, and they ended up walking into this space that she said was very beautiful, and it was it was a very pleasant experience according to this girl, which is again consistent with some of these ideas of fairyland being a beautiful place. But the girl thought it was only a few minutes, and it was 2 days later. So you have that missing time component there that appears obviously in the fairy folklore as I've talked about, but also in the UFO stuff as well. Then later that summer, there was a 5-year-old boy who also disappeared after working on some land there. This time it was a strange old man that had taken him, and it took the entire community came out, and they finally ended up giving up because they couldn't find him, and they blamed these sort of spirits of the area called the Bunian, which are again bear a lot of resemblances to the fairy folk. And then in March of 1995, after a long break, these Bunian entities were blamed again for the disappearance of a 14-year-old boy. He was on his way to school, and he just vanished without a trace until 6 days later. He was found underneath a tree, and he was weak, and he didn't really have a ton of details to provide, but he said that he had went to some sort of strange place that was filled with these friendly many people who were dressed all in white, and they gave him, these fruits and vegetables to eat. And apparently this happened again a couple of months later. He disappeared and returned. So you'll find, if you look into like these Bunian, B-U-N-I-A-N, abductions in island Southeast Asia, you'll find this time and time again. And similarly to, the Penangalan and the Pontianak that we mentioned, the Bunian were also blamed for miscarriages. And that's something that, again, has a resonance with some of the fairy stuff. It has a resonance with, obviously, the UFO stuff. There's this whole subset of researchers who study missing fetus syndrome, is what they end up calling it, which is this idea. Ufologists present it as this idea that, an abductee was gestating a human-alien hybrid, and then it was retrieved by the UFO entities. And, I can't say that that's not the case, but what I can say is that the sudden absence of a child is something that's really consistent amongst all sorts of paranormal entities from as far back as we can remember as humankind.
Yeah, you also talk about Sasquatch, Bigfoot. We refer to him as Bigfoot all the time. You talk about his abductions as well.
Yeah, and it's something that is, I find it a little bit more unsettling because it's a little bit closer to home when we think about Bigfoot. Although, there are some stories from elsewhere in the world. There's this great story that comes from France. Of course, don't call it a Bigfoot in France. You call it a wild man or something region specific. But there was a 17-year-old girl, Antoinette Coulet, I believe was her name,
yeah.
and it was the 17th century, early 17th century. She was shepherding in a region of France, and she just disappeared. And apparently later in that same year that she vanished, there were some lumberjacks who were working alongside a cave, and they heard this voice, and it said that it was Antoinette and that she had been kidnapped by a large hairy monster, by a wild man. Similarly, we see this, this was something that a lot of Native American tribes feared, was a possible abduction by Bigfoot. But we do see some indications that this happened, more recently. There are some stories that you can find if you go through old newspaper articles from the late 19th century. There was a 2-year-old who disappeared near Bradford, Pennsylvania, in July of 1888, and her disappearance, Florence Hughes was her name. Her disappearance was blamed on this. Basically Bigfoot. Of course, they didn't use that sort of language. They usually said wild man, or they would say, here he goes, Stephen. It wasn't something you see a lot. It was blamed on her. More famously, a lot of people have talked about the Dennis Martin disappearance.
Oh, yes.
Which is, a staple of the politest stuff. In 1969, 6-year-old boy who disappeared in the Great Smoky Mountains from Spence Field. Big turnout to search for him, and no one saw him, although another family heard a scream and they saw a figure running away, upright on 2 feet, carrying something on its shoulder. And I've heard that some people have come forward to claim that is not as it seems. Like there's something wrong about the account. I haven't had the time to look into it, but at the time that I wrote this, it was still being talked about as a possible Bigfoot abduction. And whether or not that was an example and that was what happened to him, there is a tradition amongst a lot of different cultures of wild men taking children.
Well, there's also that was up in the Appalachian area, Appalachian Mountains, and by that trail and up in there, there's people called the hairy people, hairy men, and they're like a wild group of people that live up in that area, and they believe that's who might have taken them, one of those hairy men. Somebody else has been talking about them, and they said the FBI know all about them.
Yeah, I mean, I've grown up and lived near Appalachia all my life, and I wouldn't doubt it. Some of these communities and those hollers are very insulated, and if you don't have a reason to go up there, you don't go up there, for a very good reason. So yeah, that's entirely possible. What is also really interesting to me too, I mean, is that there was this sort of thing that gets talked about in fairy scholarship, and it's starting to change a lot. Morgan Daimler has just released a book that addresses this very topic. But for the longest time, there was a belief that fairy traditions didn't make the journey with European settlers overseas into America very well. It was most often said that, you'll find a lot of fairy traditions in the northeast of America and, in that Nova Scotia sort of area of Canada. But you don't really find them further inland. And that just doesn't seem to be true. I mean, there are stories of Tommy knockers that you can find in Montana, and there are allusions to there was a fairy abduction that happened in Iowa at some point in the 1800s, I think, an alleged fairy abduction. So these beliefs have transmitted very well, and they took root in Appalachia more than I think a lot of people appreciated. And not only did they take root, but they also blended with, again, some of the Creek and Cherokee traditions regarding their own little people as well. So yeah, it's a unique place in America and in the world, the Appalachian Mountains, and stuff like what you said. I think I've heard that as well, and that wouldn't surprise me at all.
There's a lot of disappearances up in that area, a lot. But there's a lot of disappearances in the national forests as well. A lot.
Yeah,
and there's a lot that they don't talk about because they don't want the information out. Because if they tell people that this person disappeared here, this person disappeared at this one, they're not going to go to them. I will not go back to Yosemite. I refuse to go back to Yosemite. That's one of the hottest spots for disappearances.
Well, and I'm not even sure that, a lot of people think that it's because they know the answer to what's taking people and they're covering it up. And I'm not even sure it's that. I think they just don't want to admit that they have no idea what's doing it, Or, I'm sure that there are some tasty details that they haven't released that would, make us all raise our eyebrows and draw our own conclusions. But, I think it's just as much from an embarrassment that they're like, we don't know really what's happening here,
Well, Joshua, there's also stories where people will be walking in these forests and somebody be with them and they turn around and they're gone. They're gone.
Yeah, it happens in a blink of an eye. I was just this past week, I was just spending some time in the Uwharrie Park in North Carolina, and that thought went through my head a couple of times. You don't want to be the last person in line, and guess who was the last person in line most of the time? It was me. But yeah, and there's certain places that you go and you just feel it. You're just like, I'm not supposed to be here, And there were certainly the parts of the Uwharries that are like that. It's
and you wrote. No, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was just gonna say the Uwharries specifically, just because they're fresh in my mind. There's some people who say that they're the oldest landmass in the Western Hemisphere. That they're part of a 500 million year old archipelago, and that's sort of consistent because they're not part of the Appalachian Mountains. They're east of Charlotte, towards Raleigh, kind of where there are no other mountains anywhere around. And but as I described it to my friend who I was up there with, they are beautiful but not welcoming, I think is probably the best way to put it.
Yeah, I think you put in your book too that you believe that you said that Bigfoot and UFOs are interdimensional paranormal phenomena, and we also believe that, truly believe that.
Yeah, I don't. I would be sympathetic to that. Let's put it that way. I definitely think that there's something stranger about the Bigfoot thing that doesn't get talked about enough. There are a lot of strange Bigfoot encounters that don't really conform to that idea of a giant flesh and blood primate. Whether or not that is interdimensional, I have no idea. It might be interdimensional. I'm definitely sympathetic to that. I tend to latch on to even older ways of thinking, and I'm like, the other world, the spirit world, Tir Nanog, Middle Earth, whatever's this oldest idea of someplace else, and if you sort of put a 21st century scientific layer on that, then yeah, it could be very well be something that's interdimensional. But there does seem to be a connection between a lot of this stuff, and there are plenty of connections that you can find between the UFO stuff and the Bigfoot stuff. I know we we briefly corresponded about this a little bit, but I wrote a 2-volume series with my good friend Timothy Renner called Where the Footprints End, and it's just the strangest Bigfoot stuff that you can find that's out there. And there are some stories that really make you wonder about the most commonly held explanations that we have from cryptozoologists about what Bigfoot is and what it does and doesn't do. Yeah.
Wow, that sounds really interesting. You also talk about in this chapter alien abductions. Let's see, you say the typical alien abduction scenario, many alien abductions occur in the absence of a spacecraft. Now, I never even thought about that.
Yeah, I think that, well, I can say that plenty occur in the absence. Plenty of them happen in the presence of a spacecraft too, but if you're going through the UFO literature, you will find lots of references to people who are in their beds and there's a bright light and there's a presence in their room and they're levitated up, and the next thing that they know, they're in a space that they assume is a spacecraft. But as far as like, oh, I see a flying saucer out of my window and I'm being taken into the flying saucer, that doesn't necessarily always, it doesn't happen, I think, as often as a lot of us think. It's just that, we have all these sort of like expectations, again, talking about expectations about what that is supposed to look like, and we just sort of draw our own conclusions. So, yeah, I think it would probably be good for ufology to consider the possibility that we might be dealing with a lot of different things, in terms of what's going on with these abduction experiences. There's also the very difficult question, which doesn't get answered a lot, where there's a significant proportion of these abduction stories involve an out-of-body experience, where the person sees themselves still in bed or still on the couch or wherever they happen to be as they're being taken away. So that sort of throws into question, well, it brings up the question, interdimensional, is that what we're seeing? Or are we dealing with something spiritual or something metaphysical? But it's again, this idea that it's strictly a physical thing that's happening is, I think, something that we could afford to talk about a lot more. And I think that we, as a culture, as a society, whatever you want to call it, have a real problem with this boundary that we've put between the physical and the non-physical. And this is a little bit of a soapbox that I'll get on if you don't mind. But
go ahead.
Whenever I talk to people about Bigfoot, one of the most common bits of pushback I've heard is like, well, Bigfoot can't be some sort of spirit or ghost because spirits and ghosts don't leave footprints. And I'm like, if you look at your oldest parapsychological literature, like the first way that people started ghost hunting was to put like talcum powder on the floor and wait for footprints to appear. And
Exactly.
Ghosts leave footprints, and ghosts slam doors. So we don't understand this physical non-physical thing. The psi phenomena is the same way. Like Dean Radin, Daryl Bim, great work in the laboratory with psi phenomena. And psi phenomena is in your head, but it's interacting with our physical world. So I think that's a lot of the stuff that we're seeing is that it's something that is in this uncomfortable zone between those two things, and we don't think that way, And the way that I've started thinking about things like UFOs in particular is that, human beings are mostly physical, but an important part of us is psychic. And I kind of wonder, I'm not saying this is what's going on, but I kind of wonder if the UFO is mostly psychic but has an important physical component too. Does it step over into the physical the way that we as human beings step over into the psychic sometime? Because anybody who says that UFOs don't leave physical effects, or they don't cause burn marks in the ground, or they don't have some sort of physicality to them, they're wrong, right? But at the same time, anybody who will tell you that there's nothing, I'm just gonna say it, there's nothing spiritual going on there, and I'm not falling into the angel demon trap. I'm just saying, like, something that is, even if you want to call it extended consciousness, anybody who will tell you that doesn't happen is also not telling you the truth either. It's both these things, and that's part of the reason that it's been such a confusing and it's a confronting, complicated topic to tackle.
Well, I had told you that I had Brett Altman on the show. I've had several abductees on the show. And then the other thing, I think you also talked about Yolanda Smith. and who does the hypnotism. She hypnotizes these people who believe they have been abducted, and she's got quite a story. I'm going to have her on the show as well, because the aliens are obsessed with our bodies, and I guess our sexual organs and all that. So why do you think that is? Are they a dying breed that they need to have our sex organs or something, or they want to breed with us?
Well, I will say our bodies and our souls, because the number of experiencers who are told something vaguely spiritual, in their experiences is pretty substantial too. As far as why they focus on the surgical and reproductive elements, I mean, here's the thing that I get hung up on when I think about extraterrestrials as an answer for the UFO question, is they a lot of the surgical equipment is so cartoonish, right? Like there are these drills and these hacksaws and all these things, and like the ufologists will tell us that they're trying to get our DNA, and it's like, well, I can go down to CVS and they can swab the inside of my mouth. Like, how advanced are these extraterrestrials, right? So I suspect that there's something to that whole surgical scenario that is theatrical. It's done to induce a certain reaction. I also think that it overlaps substantially with these narratives of shamanic initiation that you'll see in different cultures all around the world. Because a strong recurring theme in those is the taking apart of the initiate and being put back together by these spirits that make you into a better, shaman, a better intercessor between the human world and the spirit world. So that's sort of where I am with the surgical thing. The reproductive angle, the obsession of other things with human sexuality is another one of those truly ancient things. It goes back to the incubi and succubi that used to assault people while they slept for the purpose of implanting or connecting or collecting genetic material. That's the most discreet way I can put it. And you do find a lot of allusions to how amorous fairies were. The fact that sometimes when they would kidnap adults, women and male artists, were especially vulnerable. And that has all sorts of implications for the number of artists that are involved in the UFO contact, I think. But they would love to abduct these, oftentimes women and artists and such, to create these human fairy hybrids as well. So there's something in this about, in that very, quite frankly, sort of Whitley Strieberrian way of communion and of sort of two becoming one and reconciling opposites and something like that. I also wonder, this is just where my head has been in the past couple of years, is I released a 2-volume set called Ecology of Souls, which is about how death connects a lot of these different topics in the paranormal in ways that were even surprising to me. And if you view these phenomena as having some sort of connection, or even I would dare say obsession with death, then it kind of makes sense that there would be a flip side of that, right? Because reproduction and death are two different sides of the same coin. So I think that might have something to do with it as well. I mean, for example, there are allusions to fairies crying at births and laughing at funerals. So there's this implication that it's a revolving door, right, between here and wherever this other space is. And so if that's the case, then that might have something to do with it as well. Exactly what? Your guess is as good as mine. And, if there is this connection that I'm perceiving, also your guess is as good as mine. But I'm not sure if the connection's there, but we as a species have made connections over the centuries between these other things that we have been encountering. Again, I believe since we, first became what we recognize as human. I think it's been with us for that long, and I think that we've been making these connections to things like death and birth and rebirth for a very, very long time.
Okay, so where was this? Okay, chapter 17. It's a ufology, hybrids, fairies, and changelings. I don't know if you want to go into the hybrids.
Yeah, so this is kind of, as I mentioned, one of the sort of driving forces for taking a look at this topic. And as we sort of talked about a little bit, changelings sort of resemble these human hybrid babies, these human alien hybrid babies. There are examples in the fairy literature of fairies taking people specifically for the purpose of procreating with them. There are these allusions to their race dying, just like as you hear sometimes in some of the modern alien stuff. But I think that it in some ways goes even deeper than that. One thing that I found really interesting is that you really have two types of fairy children, let's just say that, right? You have the changelings, and you have these human fairy hybrids. And in these stories of these human fairy hybrids, they were always like, they were great. Like, like they were, to a degree, right? So they were like very emotional and very like unpredictable and tempestuous, let's say. But they were also very artistically inclined. They were charming. They were intelligent. They were fiery and full of passion. So they were the good aspect of that. And the changelings were always the ones you didn't want to be around, right? They were the ones who were crying and sickly, and like you kind of didn't want them there, and they were prone to die, and like they weren't thriving like the human fairy hybrids were. And wouldn't you know it, when you read about sort of alien children, again, for lack of a better term, human alien children, they tend to fall into two categories as well. You've got the hybrids that we talked about earlier that never really appear all that healthy, quite frankly. There's a whole subset of alien abduction studies that talks about the baby presentation, where the parents of these hybrids will be given these children that seem completely sickly. Again, they seem sickly and weak, and then as you're holding them, they seem to get a little bit better, but they never look like they're thriving. And you also have, among the more New Age-oriented portion of the community, star children or indigo children. And how are they described? They're described just like those fairy human children. They're sort of capricious and impassionate, but very gifted in a lot of different ways. So human alien hybrids sound a lot like the changelings. The indigo and star children sound a lot like the human fairy hybrids as well. So I think that it's just, in a lot of ways, it's probably a reinvention of that particular idea. What's interesting too about the sort of indigo child, star child thing is that sometimes in these narratives you'll find a self-identifying indigo child, and I won't keep repeating indigo star. I'll just say indigo child. A lot of times you'll find a self-identifying indigo child as saying things like, my parents are imposters. They're not my real parents. And that's sort of flipping the changeling narrative on its head, right? It's in the changeling narrative that the child is the imposter, right? And I think that sometimes these things like to rework themselves that way. Even though it's a complete 180 from what the changeling scenario was, it's still the same idea of putting these two family members, parts of a family, together in incongruous ways. And I think that's interesting too. One thing that I found really fascinating from a more scientific perspective, as I alluded to, fairy infants and elderly fairies, but I also alluded to something else, which was called the stock or the fetch, which was this idea of like a log or a piece of wood or a doll or something that was made magically to look like a human child. And that was another third variant of what changelings were. Some UFO investigators, Daryl Sims was among them.
Yeah, I know Daryl.
Decided it was an interesting experiment to set up a program where they met with experiencers as soon as they remember their experience. So they would look at their body with black light to see if anything phosphoresced, right? And they came up with some interesting correlations. There were certain things about where aliens had touched them that would glow in certain ways under black light and others wouldn't. But one of the things that they noticed was that people who claimed to have held their hybrid babies purplish pinkish color. And one of the few things that also glows under a purplish pinkish color under black light is chlorophyll. And it might seem like a bit of a stretch, but you have this older idea of changelings, which we've already compared to the hybrids, right? Changelings, in some instances, being a log, being a plant that is made to look like a human being. And these experiencers are having something that resembles chlorophyll residue on their hands after holding a hybrid baby. Now, do I literally think that aliens are going around giving people logs like in Twin Peaks or something? No, I don't. But I can't help but see that sort of similarity there, and I don't know if it's working on like some sort of like archetypal level or if it's working on some sort of like subconscious. I don't know exactly what's going on there, but it is an interesting connection that you could draw between these two things. Okay,
Joshua, tell them the story about the twin syndrome.
So this was a really interesting avenue to sort of pursue, and it's not something that I really expected, but as we've talked about earlier, there's this whole subset of study in ufology where missing fetus syndrome is what they call it, and it's this idea that your hybrid child is taken out of your body. What is interesting about this is that there are stories where some of these indigo and star children will know about another missing child. Let me explain this. There's a whole condition known as vanishing twin syndrome, and it wasn't recognized until the 40s, but basically the scenario is that in a case of a multi-fetal pregnancy, one of the fetuses will disappear. It most often happens with twins. That's why it's called vanishing twin syndrome. But the child is either miscarried, is miscarried, but its fetal tissue is either absorbed by its siblings or the placenta or the mother. It's diagnosed more today than it ever was, but we still don't really have a great idea of its frequency. Some people think that it happens in about 30% of multi-fetal pregnancies. It just never goes noticed. But it's interesting because there is a crossover with this indigo child, millennium child, star child idea, where some of these are the surviving twin from something like missing twin syndrome. And there are even stories. Carol Dennis, whom I've spoken with personally, wrote a book called The Millennium Children, and she talked about a father who knew that his wife had this vanishing twin syndrome happen to her during her pregnancy, and his daughter came up to him and was, they were having some sort of conversation, and the topic came up of her mother having lost one of the children, and he was saying, there were two umbilical cords, and that's how we knew at the time, because one of them was sort of had sort of healed over like a stump. And he was explaining this to his daughter, and I'm sorry, I'm mixing the story up. He hadn't explained this to his daughter. His daughter came to him at the age of 9 and said, "I was a twin daddy." That's what it was. I'm sorry, I was a little bit backwards there. She came to him when she was 9 and said, I was a twin daddy. He was like, "How did you know this? I haven't told you this before." And that's when he explained it to her. And she said, "Yeah, Dad, I know where my twin is. She's up on the spaceship, and I talk to her all the time." This is one of these children that was perceived as being an indigo child or a star child. What's interesting is that there are some psychologists who think that the survivors of vanishing twin syndrome, the surviving child, actually retains some sort of subconscious sense of guilt about what happened, and that they end up sneaking food, and they feel like they need to overeat and such. And that's, again, consistent with what you hear in these changeling narratives too, is that the changeling eats and eats and eats and is never satisfied. So it's an interesting connection there. There's also a connection that it was an Australian survey that found that twins who who survives vanishing twins in general have a greater risk of cerebral palsy.
That's what I read. I can't believe that. I'm an identical twin.
I have twins myself. I have identical twins
You're
myself.
You're a twin too? No kidding.
But that's another one of those. We mentioned some of these conditions that people have had and people have tried to use as explanations for changelings. Well, that's one of them as well as cerebral palsy. It's one of like 15 different things that have been proposed over the years. So again, another little sort of connection there as well. Sorry, I sort of stumbled over the story, but yeah, it's really impressive whenever you have some child coming forward with that sort of first-hand knowledge that they shouldn't have. But again, it's that idea of just as the child that was taken in these changeling stories is living this life of paradise in fairyland. Sometimes in these stories, as in the story with that girl, she said, no, my missing twin sister, the one who died, is on a spaceship. So it's the exact same idea, even though the human child's still there. So it's just these little tiny like fractal resonances that you find here and there. Yeah.
Okay, now the last chapter 18 on lore. There was a section in your in chapter 18 and it's titled Lore, Sasquatch documented abductions. And you talk about the lures, like fairies, aliens, Sasquatch sometimes lure or entice their prey. Their mimicry is incredible. Babies crying, human voices, calling their dogs barking, sparrows chirping. Talk about that.
So there is this whole idea, as we sort of talked about a little bit earlier, about this idea that these things have this ability to mimic, and this is something that I covered in even greater depth in Where the Footprints End, is the number of things that are strange sounds in the forest that we now attribute to Bigfoot that we once would have attributed to fairies is pretty impressive. Everything, especially in the Bigfoot stuff, like you'll hear people say that they can mimic birds, you'll hear people say that they can mimic, heavy loading equipment like forklifts and stuff, and you come away with the sense that like Bigfoot is the best mimic in the animal kingdom, if it is indeed an animal. But there's a famous Bigfoot story that's told about it was in a place in Oklahoma that I believe it's spelled Honobia, but I believe I've heard from locals that it's pronounced Honubi. I'm not sure, but
I've never heard of it.
But that sort of event kicked off with one of the witnesses hearing a voice in the woods that sounded like his voice, just a little bit different, just different enough to differentiate. Hearing his own voice, coming from the forest, calling for his dogs, and you see this in a lot of different places. You even find it in other parts of the world. There was a 1977 case that Janet and Colin Board talked about an individual in Shanxi province, China. Everywhere's got their own version of Bigfoot, right? And China has the Yeren. And this wild man, this Yeren that this person saw, made like 11 or 12 different sounds, and one was a sparrow, and another was a dog barking, and a leopard growl, and a pony neighing, and again, an infant crying, like we've talked about earlier, like the idea of the infant crying happening as this sound. And that was something that, John Keel, who I've mentioned a couple of times, noticed as well. He said that it's buried in one of his books, and I don't know which one off the top of my head, but he had said that two of the things that he noticed in terms of like just sounds in these sort of encounters were the sound of a car door slamming and the sound of an infant crying. And you don't hear about the car door thing too much, although I've talked to some people here and there, including some close friends who have had that happen, like in the middle of nowhere where there shouldn't be another car anywhere around. So yeah, now I'm not sure what the car door thing means, but the idea of the sound of a child crying is something that you see all across this stuff. Not just the Bigfoot stuff, but again, the fairy stuff as well. And even, not even the European stuff, but even over here in the New World, there is a rarely discussed fairy that was part of the tribal beliefs of the Catawba Indians, who were the Indians that were they were the Native Americans who were living in the place where I grew up. a type of little people that they called the wild Indians, the Yehesuri, and they said that they would often make the sound of crying infants as well. So yeah, the similarities just keep coming, you know. that's always what I find so interesting is when you have these populations that are separated by time and distance, or like, you know, if you find someone who is in like, you know, Casey, Iowa, and has an experience that sounds like it was taken right out of an old Mesopotamian text, it's like, I doubt that he was reading that. Why is this so similar? And I think it always points to, at the end of the day, the possibility, the likelihood that these things have some sort of objective reality to them.
Let's see, also in that chapter you said that Sasquatch's interest in children is reported in some of the earliest encounters back in 1910 from Wisconsin. Do you remember that?
Yeah, I mean, so you'll find a lot of stories where the first person to see the Bigfoot is a child. I'm thinking specifically about, I believe that was the case in the Missouri Monster or Momo sightings that happened in the confusingly named town of Louisiana, Missouri. But yeah, there was an account that I did find of a 10-year-old girl in Wisconsin who was being followed out of the woods by this hairy, furry creature. Similarly, you know, there were some other stories that I found from places like Canada around the same time period that, you know, where they would see a gorilla in the bushes that was smiling at them and sort of urging them to come closer, which is a terrifying thing to think. You know, another good example of that is a famous example of that is the Ruby Creek incident that Ivan T. Sanderson talked about, where the mother, and I think it might have been Chilliwack, it was somewhere in Canada, I believe. Forgive me if I'm getting that wrong, but the children saw, you know, this thing in the field, and the mother comes up and hides her children behind a blanket because she had heard stories that, you know, about this Bigfoot or Sasquatch curse, which again, you know, has sort of some of those things that you would expect from fairy folklore in there, with the idea of being cursed for noticing them or something like that. Yeah,
you also documented in 1897 multiple children playing in the woods.
Yeah. So that comes from there was some children in the woods who claimed that a wild man was trying to grab them, and that comes from. It's interesting because if you look back through those old, like, again, late 1800s newspaper reports, you'll find lots of references to wild men doing things like this. This particular example that you're mentioning came from my co-author, Where the Footprints in, Timothy Renner, who just went through all these old newspapers and pulled out anything that sounded remotely like a Bigfoot. And there's some real gems in his books of some of these historical accounts, like this one near Pottstown, where there were these children who were playing in the woods, and they had to get out of the way of this Bigfoot. Similarly, you know, we were talking about the Almas, the Yeren. The Almas is the Russian Bigfoot. We're talking about the Yeren in China. In 1957, there was a Yeren that grabbed a child in a region of China and tried to get away with the kid, and had to be beaten with a stick, and only then did it drop her. And I think it was probably 68. There was another 4-year-old that was grabbed by a Bigfoot in Missouri, and this one, the Bigfoot didn't have to be beaten with a stick. It just dropped the child after her aunt screamed, and the family dog chased it. So it's a little bit easier to get away. But yeah, like, it's just a question of, like, why would these things want to kidnap us? And of course, you know, the thing with Bigfoot that you go to is like, oh, you know, it wants to eat them, I guess, or something like that. But you know, a lot of these Native American tribes would talk about Bigfoot taking women as well. So again, women and children, the same thing that you hear from the fairy stuff as well. The suggestion that Sasquatch are kidnapping children for the purposes of replenishing their species, or that they're kidnapping women to mate with them, it's kind of in there some. There's a pretty famous story, I don't think I talked about it in this, or maybe I did, of Seraphine Long.
No.
I talked about it a little bit more in a Trojan Feast, but this is a very famous account of a it's a 1954 article by J.W. Burns. It was a 17-year-old Chehalis woman named Seraphine Long who was walking home, and this hairy hand grabs her and takes her to a cave. And she doesn't see where this cave is because it rubs tree gum over her eyes, which is an odd detail that you don't hear in a lot of Bigfoot stories. But again, I guess it shouldn't be surprising at this point. The idea of rubbing ointment on the eyes and then winding up in the lair of some sort of supernatural beast is something that you see all over fairy folklore. There's an entire subset of fairy legends called the midwife to the fairies, and in those stories, a human midwife is fetched to come attend the birth of a fairy, and in order to it depends on the retelling, but in order to either see her surroundings or to administer to the child later, there is this ointment that goes on the eyes that allows them to perceive the area around them. And in the case of, sometimes later it's like, oh, well, that doesn't happen in that particular part of the story, but the midwife is given some ointment to put on the fairy child, and she actually accidentally gets some in her eye, and then she sees fairyland for what it truly is, right? So the idea that Bigfoot kidnaps Seraphine Long and rubs tree gum over her eyes, and the next thing she knows, she's in the Bigfoot cave. It seems to me like the repetition of the same sort of story beats. In the case of Seraphine, she supposedly gave birth to the creature's child. She eventually was able to secure her release back to her tribe, but as from what I remember of the story, the child that she gave birth to only lasted like a few hours. It was not a successful venture. But there are other indications that you see elsewhere that there's a procreation, maybe not agenda, but procreation does happen between human beings and Bigfoot, and that's one of the reasons that you see the abduction of women. Yeah.
Okay, so can I end the show with a last story from, it's in that same chapter, Jeff Meldrum, in his book, Sasquatch Legend Meets Science. Do you remember that one? From Uganda?
Is this the one about the chimpanzee?
Yeah.
Yeah, and this is something that you'll hear. Jeff Meldrum, and again, disclaimer, I love that book. I love Legend Meets Science. I think the world of Jeff Meldrum's research, even though I don't think we agree on what Bigfoot is, that's the first book that I will give to people when they say that they're interested in Bigfoot. I'm like, here, read this. This will get you where you need to be to start, and then eventually, years later, I'll have them read Where the Footprints End. But I love his work, even though we don't agree on necessarily what Bigfoot is. He's done so much good for legitimizing the topic. But he was citing this as an example of how similar these North American tribal beliefs are to what you'll find in certain parts of Africa. And he cited an example from Sierra Leone in the 20s, where there was a boy who was 12 years old who was attacked and taken by a chimpanzee, and I'm not sure if he survived, but he was maimed. Meldrum himself found 8 accounts over a 17-year period in Uganda of chimpanzees that were taking children. Historical accounts, to say nothing of the fact that a lot of these communities had reason to fear chimpanzees for this reason that they historically and traditionally knew of as well. So the idea of ape men taking children is something that seems to have a basis in fact as well. So just because it has these resonances to fairy lore doesn't mean that it also doesn't have some resonances to what we know about the animal world as well. Yeah.
Wow, that's really scary. Did any of those children were they ever returned? Were they ever found?
I'm not sure, but if you want some nightmare fuel, look up chimpanzee attacks and just read about them. We don't think of chimpanzees as being especially dangerous, but they are. I personally would almost rather be attacked by a lion than a chimpanzee.
Oh my God!
Because the chimps go for the face. Like the chimps tend to go for the face. So it's not, it's you might not die from a chimp attack, but your quality of life is going to be significantly impacted. So yeah, in that sense, I'd probably rather be attacked by a lion, to be frank with you.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Oh, Joshua, thank you so much. I just enjoyed you tremendously. Thank you for being on the show, and I know the viewers loved you tonight, and we really enjoyed. The book is fabulous, you guys. You can get it on Amazon. He has other books, 11 other books that are, I'm going to have to check them out because I'd love to have Joshua back. But this book is so good. It has so many great. What's so enjoyable about the book is that you added stories. It's just not a straight written book. You add interest to the book, and that's what's so great about it. It was really interesting, and I really enjoyed it.
Well, thank you so much. I tried to, and a big part of the book too is, I try to cite my sources really well, so that if someone is interested in a story, there's probably a lot more to read about it, and you can track it down by going through the endnotes and taking a look at where I read it, and then finding where that is. And there's always I like to think of it as the gift that keeps on giving. And I've talked to some people who have sort of been led down their own personal rabbit holes just after pursuing one endnote in my books, and that really always makes me feel good to know that I've led people to become more curious. Yeah. Oh
yes, and if I had time, I would have done that. And I thought that was really great. Really, you did a really excellent job on this.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much.
And thank you so much for appearing on the show, and I hope to have you back again, Joshua. Thank you very much.
It was an absolute pleasure, and just let me know. I hope you have a great rest of the week and weekend, I guess, at this point. So,
and you too.
But, thank you so much.
Thank you. Good night, Joshua. Thank you so much. Good night.
Good night.
Well, guys, I hope you enjoyed the show. I did. He was just a delight. If you're still watching, if you would please hit the like, I'd appreciate it. And for those who are maybe new to the show, if you haven't subscribed, I'd appreciate it. So I noticed that you aren't getting, you're not getting notified of the shows. So I noticed on the front page, the main page of my channel, when I post my shows, there's a bell you have to hit, and for a reminder. They're not sending them out. I'm subscribed to Drew Beeson, and I never get notified of his shows. So you're gonna have to go to my main channel, ParanormalZoneTV, and I try to go put my shows. I try to set up the events ahead of time, and you have to click for a reminder. That's the only way you're going to get reminded. I mean, I hear this all the time. I never got a reminder. But anyway, I'm going to check out. He's got 11 other books, so I'm going to check out his other books. I really like more of the paranormal, but he's really fascinating, and he's really good. So I really enjoyed the show tonight, and let's see, what was my next? Oh, what did I do with my calendar? Okay, well, I have 2 shows on my front page on my channel. Let's see, I can't remember. I think it's Matt Emmich. When he was a teenager, he and his friends went into a abandoned mill, steel mill or some kind of a mill, and they were confronted by Dogman. And he's got quite a story, but I can't remember. Anyway, June set out. I saved June for Dave Spinks. We're going to do myths, legends, and folklore. And then Jen's coming back also in June, but she's coming back in May as well. Oh, and Steve Stockton's coming back. I think it's in May. We're going to do the triangles. So if you want to get reminded, I'm sorry, I can't help what YouTube does. They're just not sending out reminders. So you're going to have to, like I said, you're going to have to go. You're going to have to hit that bell so you'll get a reminder. Anyway, thank you all so much for being here tonight. I was really excited with Joshua. It was really a great show. So let me do some shout outs, and my mods. I want to thank my mods, Renee and Chipateri. Thank you so much. I love you girls so much. Thank you for being here. So let me do some shout outs. Oh, and my buddy Tallcross from Scotland. Thank you for being here as always, and for everybody else as well. So let me do some shout outs. Sheila Pelican, Andrew and the Gnomes. Okay, I saw something about Renee and Andrew want to come on the show. Let me know. Renee, talk to me. Send me a message. What's that? You guys want to come on the show? Let me know. Let's see. Anybody that's left in the chat room? I didn't see everybody that was here. Andrew and the Gnomes Trucking Express. Be safe out there, honey. Okay, everybody. I am Alpha. Oh, we missed you. I am Alpha. Welcome back. Betty Spaghetti. I love your name. I love spaghetti. You know, I got to tell you a story. Hold on for a minute. Anybody else? Anybody else in here? It's my... Okay, I don't see anybody else. Oh, Sun. I got to tell you guys a story. Hold on. Don't go. I want to tell you something. I didn't want to say... because I didn't want to interrupt Joshua by telling this. Okay, Albert Witch? Anybody else that's still left that wants a... Okay, alright, so... I don't know if you remember Donna Raymond. I know Chipateri and Renee do. She used to come here, and years ago, I guess it was 2012, she would be my co-host. And she was also part of my paranormal team. Well, anyway, there's two stories. We had stopped doing paranormal investigating, and she went off on her own, and she got a job at an angel store in Benicia. And she didn't live very far from me. She lived in Pleasant Hill. She didn't live very far from me. And she said, Noreen, you have to come to this angel store and you have to do a show here. The husband's is a fairy and the wife is a hobbit. And, you know, I didn't really believe it, but I know Donna doesn't tell stories. So one night I got my equipment and my team, and we went over to this angel store, and I met them. Now, this was in 2012, so you're going to have to forgive me if I can't remember what we talked about. And as well, I lost that show, because before I started doing YouTube, I was on Justin TV, I was on a live stream and another one, and I lost hundreds of shows, because I've been doing this since 2008. So I lost 100, lots of shows. So anyway, so when I went over to meet them, like I said, he was a fairy, and I forgot to ask Josh about that. And she was a hobbit. Oh, I swear to God. And he was telling me stories about fairies, but I can't remember. But I want to tell you about her. She was about 4 foot tall, and if you pull up a picture of a gnome or a hobbit, she looked exactly like that image, and she had pointed ears. I couldn't believe it. So I think they were the real deal, and I'm sorry, I'm so upset that I don't have that show, because that's something I could never replace. That's never happened to me before. Now, another time, Don and I went to a paranormal event, and we were sitting there with our cards and everything, and this woman came up with her daughter. She was a teenager, and Donna looked at me. She goes, "Noreen, she's a star child." And I said, "Yes, how do you know?" She goes, "I'm telling you, she's a star child." So the mother came up, and Donna was listed there as a psychic. You know, she's extremely intuitive. And the woman said, "You know, I really need to talk to you." She said, my daughter isn't like other children." And Donna said, "Well, do you know that your child's a star child?" And she said, I don't know. I don't know what she is. But she has this gift, and she draws. Well, you know, I mean, okay, she draws. And she had her case with her. And Donna said, "Well, would you show us your drawings?" And she looked at her mother, and she didn't want to. I mean, it was like something really sacred to her. She didn't want to show us. And Donna kind of talked her into it and was really nice to her. And she said, you know, more or less, "We would really like to see your drawings." And so the girl pulled out they were big on poster boards, big drawings. I have never in my life seen anything like what she drew. She brought about 10 of them with her. They were masterpieces, absolutely masterpieces. And then after she had showed us the pictures, the woman, the girl wanted to talk to Donna. So the girl got up, and she went somewhere, and was talking to Donna, and I don't know what they talked about, but those were two really, and see, those are experiences I'll always remember, and they will never be replaced. So I just wanted to tell you that, and I didn't want to say it during the show with Joshua, but I wanted to tell you guys. Okay, so with that, I'm gonna go. Have a wonderful weekend. I hope you had a great Easter. And so don't forget, oh gosh, and I don't even know what the date of the next show is. Let me see. Oh, I don't want to wreck this. Okay, so you just go to my channel and you'll find out the next show. It's not next week, but it's a week after, and I think it's Matt. Emsch. So anyway, everybody, I love you guys. Thank you so much. Please, I don't see any more likes up here. If you would, oh, look it. This is Luna. This is my Luna. This is one of my 6 cats that are left. I had 18, now I got 6. And this is Luna. Hey, Luna. Okay, everybody, so I'm going to go. Have a great weekend. And I love her to death. I'll see you guys in a week and a half, okay? Love you guys. Good night.